welcome back to week 12 of Doing Research in Psychology Advanced. So this is our last week of the semester, and we have no new material or content that we're going to be covering this week, but what we're going to be doing is taking a quick look at what we've learned over the last 12 weeks of the semester. Okay, so let's rewind a little bit here. In first year research methods, we delve quite deeply into learning about research design, how to identify variables, how to identify different sorts of psychological questions, correlational questions versus experimental questions, and the various different designs that we can use to answer and test those sorts of questions. And also measurement scales and how to identify different sorts of measurement scales and when we might use them. So then in second year research methods, we bring all of this knowledge we have with us about research design and extend on that. We focus here a little bit more deeply on the data analysis side of things. So once we have a data set using a particular kind of research design, what do we do with it? How do we ask and answer questions of the data that were relevant to our broader research question that we started out with when we designed our particular study? We learn about things like simple linear regression, correlation, and the theoretical underpinnings of probability theory, how to run a t-test to compare two different groups. So this gives us a solid foundation for how to analyze data in psychology. Now in third year research methods, in this course, Doing Research in Psychology Advanced, the goal is to bring each of the different components of the research process together. So take a big step back and take a look at the research process as a whole. So while the foundational courses focus on developing a deep understanding of one of the components of the research process, this course is focused much more on developing a breadth of understanding of the entire research process. So starting with the question that we have about psychology in the world, distilling that down into a hypothesis or a prediction, designing a study that's most appropriate for addressing that particular question or those sets of predictions that we might have, carrying out research in a way where we're less likely to be susceptible to human biases and error in human judgment, analysing our data in such a way that's going to be reproducible by others, and interpreting that data in a way that's sort of open and transparent, and also communicating not just the final end result of our studies, but also the way in which we arrive at knowledge when we conduct research in psychology is also fundamentally important in the communication side of things as well. So we're considering the whole research process together in this course. So I hope this course has been useful in thinking about the whole research process and putting the human at the center of that process. We make decisions at every step of the research process, and it's important to be open about those decisions so that others can verify our research findings, reproduce what we've done, and also extend and build on our research findings. This is how knowledge accumulates. So let's take a look at the playlist of all of the episodes we've covered throughout the semester. So in week 1, we learned about things like the objectivity illusion and naive realism, this idea that we feel as though we have a direct readout on reality, that what we see is an objective reflection of reality, whereas what we see and how we make decisions and how we understand the world is very much shaped by our prior experiences with the world. So what we see and how we understand the world might not be the same thing as how somebody else sees the same information and understands the same information. And this is because we rely on a range of cognitive shortcuts to make sense of complex information. So for example, we rely on things like representativeness, or how closely or how similar something looks to something we've encountered in the past and how likely that is to occur. We rely on things like the availability heuristic, or how easily something comes to mind. And we're also susceptible to a range of different biases. So things like hindsight bias, this tendency to see an outcome as if it was obvious or predictable all along, that we had predicted it all along. And also things like confirmation bias, where we seek out information that confirms our prior beliefs and expectations, and ignore or downplay information that disconfirms our prior beliefs and expectations. So while these cognitive heuristics or shortcuts are really adaptive for the most part. Occasionally they can lead us astray when we're faced with a situation that falls outside of our prior experiences, or that's unexpected or rare or extreme in some way. And because researchers are only human as well, these sorts of errors and biases can impact on the sorts of decisions that are being made as a part of the research process. And they can result in errors in research findings if we're not careful about how we go about doing research in psychology and in other areas as well. This is why it's so important to be open not just about our research findings, but also how we produce those research findings. If we've documented the decisions that we've made along the way, then it's much harder, for example, to hypothesize after the results are known, or to write up a research paper with a set of predictions that align with the results after the fact, or to fool ourselves into thinking that we planned a particular set of obscure data analytic steps ahead of time because they produce a significant result that we can publish. There are things that we can do, being open about how we do research in psychology, that help to mitigate some of these errors, and human errors and biases in the research process. In episode 2, we looked at things like correlational research questions, where we're examining how things tend to go together. We're measuring or observing things in the world and seeing how they relate to one another or how they go together, versus experimental research questions, where we ask, what effect does variable X have on variable Y? Here we distinguish between correlation and causation in the sorts of claims that we make, in the language we use when we're describing our research findings. We talked about things like the third variable problem, where there's another sort of lurking or unobserved variable that can explain the relationship between two observed variables in a study or an experiment that we're interested in. This is a really important concept to think about as we do research in psychology, because if we're going to be making explicit claims about the relationships between variables, we want to make sure that we've thought deeply about possible alternative explanations, other variables that might explain that relationship that we haven't accounted for. In this episode, we also learned about signal detection theory as a framework or a metaphor for thinking about significance testing in psychology. There are two ways of being right and two ways of being wrong. And we want to make sure that we consider all four decision outcomes when we make categorical decisions about things in the world. So if we conclude that there is a relationship or an effect between two different variables, we can be right in that decision, but we can also be wrong in that decision. And likewise, if we conclude that we can't conclude that there is a relationship between two different variables in the world, we can be right about that decision and we can be wrong about that decision. So it's important to consider the uncertainty, the inherent uncertainty involved in making these sorts of decisions about the world. In episode 3, we learned about things like the law of large numbers. So the larger the sample of observations, the more likely it is that that sample will approximate the population distribution that we're sampling from. The smaller the sample, if we only have very few observations, the less likely it is that that sample will approximate or resemble the population distribution we're sampling from. Remember here that chance can be lumpy in the short run, so it's easy to produce spurious correlations and differences with a small number of observations just due to chance alone. We also learned about this concept of regression to the mean. So if we score extremely poorly or extremely well on a particular task relative to our true average performance on that task, then the next time we perform that task, we're more likely to perform closer to our average or our mean performance. So if on our first performance we perform really poorly relative to our average performance, then our second performance will be better. If on our first performance we perform really well compared to our average performance, then our second performance will be worse. Right? So this is this idea of regression to the mean. And we also learned about how different chance explanations for our findings or our data play out with different research designs. So within subjects' designs, experimental designs, for instance, are more powerful than between subjects' designs because we're comparing apples with apples. Every participant is participating in every single condition in our experiment, which means that we don't need to worry about chance variation as a result of different people being randomly assigned to different conditions in our experiment. So we don't have to worry about chance variation introduced by a random assignment when we use a within subjects research design, because we're not using random assignment. Every participant participates in every single condition. So if we can use within subjects designs in our research, they can be a really powerful way of combating particular kinds of chance explanations for our data. And at the end of episode 3 and in episode 4, we took a deep look at how we compare and analyse differences and the sorts of assumptions we make when we're dealing with paired data, as in a within subjects research design, versus independent data, as in a between subjects research design. We learned about the different assumptions of the t-test versus the Mann-Whitney-U, and a different style or class of test, which is the permutation test, that we can use to compare differences between two groups. We also learned about when and how we might apply the analysis of variance to see whether or not there are any differences between more than two groups in a particular data set. But while the analysis of variance is a very handy tool for letting us know if our independent variable has an overall effect on our dependent variable, it's not very good for telling us what aspects of our independent variable are driving that effect when we have more than two groups. So this is where planned contrasts come in. So we would use different kinds of contrasts, treatment contrasts, helmet contrasts, polynomial contrasts, depending on the research question that we have, and also depending on the data set that we have available to us. Then in episode 5, we take a much more critical look at interpreting the p-value, what it can and can't tell us about our data when we run a significance test to examine a relationship or a difference between groups. We learn about the overall logic of significance testing and how we make inferences about the world based on what we know about the null distribution, about the chance or the noise distribution. So essentially, when we run a significance test, we're considering what we might expect simply due to chance alone, and then we're evaluating how likely it is that our sample of observations is to have occurred due to chance alone, or whether it's very unlikely to have occurred due to chance alone. And we set ourselves a 5% cutoff, or a p-value of 0.05, for deciding when to reject the null hypothesis that our sample of observations can be explained simply due to chance. We also learned about the distribution of p-values. If we run an experiment 100 times and there is no effect or relationship in reality, then our distribution of p-values should be uniform. Every single p-value is equally likely to occur under the null hypothesis. Where there is no effect, every p-value is equally likely to occur. In this episode, we also learn the difference between a raw effect size versus a standardized effect size, and what statistical power is, and why it's important to consider when we're designing experiments in psychology. In episode 6, we learn about the concept of a family-wise error rate, and the importance of considering the multiple different tests that we run on the same null hypothesis. So for example, if we start out by running a one-tailed significance test, but switch to using a two-tailed significance test after finding a surprising result in the opposite direction, then we artificially inflate our type 1 error rate, our chances of false alarming when we decide to reject the null hypothesis. We covered a few different examples where we might run multiple comparisons testing the same null hypothesis. We also learn about ways in which we can correct for that inflation of our type 1 error rate where we do want to run, or it's necessary to run, multiple comparisons. We learn about things like the Texas sharpshooter fallacy and the importance of not passing off exploratory results as confirmatory ones. We also learn about things like inflation bias, where undisclosed flexibility in data analytic decisions can artificially inflate the positive results that are being reported in the literature. And we learn about things like selection bias or publication bias, which is a tendency to only publish positive results or significant findings, and to leave null results or negative findings unpublished. And then in episode 7, we learn about some of the open science practices we can use to combat these issues of selection bias and inflation bias in research and psychology. So by sharing the different elements of our research process, not just the end result, we make it easier for people to evaluate the sorts of decisions that we make along the way. So open research practices are really about sharing as many of the elements of the research cycle as we can. So we can document our hypotheses and predictions, the tools we're going to use in our entire research plan. We can even document the code that we're going to use to analyze our data on a public online repository as a part of a pre-registration process. Then once we collect the data, we can share our data, our raw data, on a public repository as well for other researchers to verify our results and extend on our conclusions. And by making these earlier components of our research cycle publicly available, it's much easier to evaluate the end result, how the results have been interpreted and how they've been communicated, and the extent to which that maps onto or corresponds to the original research plan. So open research practices offer a solution to some of the sources of error and bias at the different stages of research. And there are a range of free online tools and platforms now that enable researchers to publicly archive and share the different elements of their research process, and also to get credit for those contributions as well. So extending on this idea of open research practices, in episode 8, we took a deeper look at how we can make our data analysis process more open and reproducible. So in the context of using R, we learn about the difference between running our analyses in the console, which can make it very difficult to save our work and come back to it later on, and using and saving our work as an R script or in a R notebook. And we also learn about different ways in which we can visualize our data in R using ggplot2, which is a part of the tidyverse package, to reveal much more than just the summary statistics of our data. We can reveal and look at the shape of our distributions and analyze and evaluate the distributional assumptions that we're making as a part of our research. We can overlay the raw data so that we can see exactly what's going on. And we can make different kinds of choices that reveal different elements of our data set before we've conducted a single analysis. In episode 9, Professor Augustinus introduced us to the philosophy and core principles behind the discursive psychological approach to finding things out. In episode 10, we learn about how people can represent reality through text and talk. And in our final episode, episode 11, Professor Augustinus reintroduced us to Milgram's experiment, but through the lens of discursive psychology. And that brings us to this week, the course in review. We still have one final class left, and so I'm looking forward to wrapping up the course with everyone, so I'll see you in class.